Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The thick November fog of 1895 had settled over Baker Street like a suffocating blanket, reducing the familiar sounds of London to muffled echoes that seemed to drift from another world entirely. For 3 interminable days, the weather had confined us to our lodgings at 221B, and I watched with growing concern as my friend Sherlock Holmes alternated between periods of feverish activity and profound lethargy. He had spent the morning conducting some malodorous chemical experiment that filled our sitting room with acrid fumes, only to abandon it suddenly and retreat to his armchair, where he now sat motionless, his long fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, staring at the dancing flames in the grate as though they might reveal some cosmic truth. I had attempted to engage him with news of the recent reforms at Scotland Yard, but my efforts were met with nothing more than a languid wave of his hand. The violin lay neglected across his knees, and I knew, from long experience, that when Holmes reached this state of ennui, only a case of sufficient complexity could rouse him from his melancholy. Outside, the gas lamps flickered weakly through the yellow murk, casting ghostly shadows that seemed to mock our confinement. The sharp chime of the bell below shattered the oppressive silence like a pistol shot. Holmes straightened instantly, his grey eyes blazing with sudden interest as his lethargy fell away like a discarded cloak. We heard Mrs. Hudson's measured tread upon the stairs, followed by lighter, more frantic footsteps that seemed to stumble in their haste. A moment later, our door flew open to reveal a gentleman in such obvious distress that I immediately rose from my chair. He was perhaps 40 years of age, with the bearing of old money and social position, yet his usual composure had clearly deserted him. His dark hair was dishevelled, silver threads catching the lamplight, and though his clothes were of the finest cut, his collar sat askew, and his cravat had been knotted with less than perfect precision. Most telling of all, his hands trembled violently as they clutched a leather portfolio to his chest, and his face bore the pallor of a man who had seen something that challenged his very understanding of reality. Holmes had already unfolded his tall frame from the armchair, and now stood before the fireplace, his hawk-like gaze taking in every detail of our visitor's appearance. Without waiting for an introduction, he began his customary demonstration of deductive reasoning. "You are recently returned from military service in India," Holmes observed, reaching for his pipe with casual precision. "A man of considerable social standing, though you left the army some 15 years ago to manage family estates. You have a daughter whose recent engagement has been announced in the society pages, and you are here because something impossible has occurred involving a photograph." He struck a match and applied it to his pipe, never taking his eyes from our visitor's face. "I suggest you take a seat and tell us everything, omitting no detail, however insignificant it may appear." Our visitor sank into the offered chair as though his legs would no longer support him, his face growing even paler. "Good God, Mr. Holmes, well, how could you possibly know about the photograph? I've told absolutely no one about what I discovered this morning." His voice carried the cultured accent of his class, but it trembled with barely controlled agitation. Holmes waved away the question with characteristic impatience. "Elementary observations, I assure you. The tan line on your wrist indicates the recent removal of a military watch worn for many years. Your complexion and the slight yellowing of your eyes speak of prolonged exposure to the Indian climate. Your daughter's engagement to young Lord Ashworth was announced in yesterday's Times, which I read while Watson thought me comatose. As for the photograph, you carry that portfolio as though it contains something of immense value, and there is the distinct chemical odour of photographic developing solution clinging to your coat." The gentleman introduced himself as Sir Reginald Blackwood of Blackwood Manor, and as he spoke, His grip on the portfolio tightened until his knuckles showed white. "Mr. Holmes, I am a rational man, educated at Cambridge, with no belief in the supernatural. Yet what I must tell you will strain your credulity, as it has nearly destroyed my sanity. 3 days ago, I commissioned a formal portrait of my family to commemorate my daughter Victoria's engagement. The photograph was delivered yesterday evening, and I placed it in my study before retiring. This morning, when I entered that same room, the photograph had changed overnight, revealing something that was never there when the picture was taken." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with that predatory intensity I knew so well, and for the first time in days I heard him laugh, a low, sharp sound of pure intellectual delight. "There, Watson!" Holmes exclaimed, his previous lethargy completely banished by the prospect of an intellectual challenge. "You see before us the very antidote to tedium, a problem that defies conventional explanation, yet surely yields to methodical analysis. Sir Reginald, pray show us this remarkable photograph and omit no detail of its transformation, however trivial it may appear." Sir Reginald's hands trembled as he unfastened the leather portfolio, withdrawing a large mounted photograph of exceptional clarity. The silver gelatin print measured perhaps 10 by 12 inches, executed with the technical precision one would expect from London's finest studios. The composition showed Sir Reginald seated in an ornate wing-back chair within what appeared to be his manners library, while his daughter Victoria stood beside him in an elegant white gown that spoke of her recent engagement. The setting was richly appointed with heavy draperies, leather-bound volumes, and the warm glow of gaslight creating an atmosphere of comfortable prosperity. Holmes seized the photograph with the eagerness of a scholar examining a rare manuscript, carrying it immediately to our window where the grey afternoon light, despite the persistent fog, provided adequate illumination. He produced his magnifying lens and began a meticulous examination of every inch of the print's surface, his sharp features concentrated in that familiar expression of intense focus that I had witnessed countless times before. "I confess I see nothing extraordinary," I ventured, peering over his shoulder at what appeared to be a conventional family portrait. "The composition is traditional, the lighting adequate, and the subjects posed in the customary manner of formal portraiture." "Look more carefully, Watson," Sir Reginald urged, his voice tight with barely controlled agitation. "Direct your attention to the heavy curtains behind my daughter's left shoulder. When the photograph was taken 3 days ago and when it was delivered to me yesterday evening, those curtains were drawn completely shut. I remember distinctly ordering them closed to prevent glare from interfering with the exposure. Yet now—" Holmes adjusted his lens and bent closer to the indicated area. I followed his gaze and felt a distinct chill as the details became clear. Between the heavy velvet curtains, which now showed a narrow gap that had not been there before, a pale face was visible pressed against the glass from outside. The features were indistinct but unmistakably human, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at the young woman in the foreground with an expression of unmistakable malevolence. "Most singular," Holmes murmured, his voice devoid of emotion, though his examination never wavered. "The photographic emulsion shows no signs of tampering, no evidence of double exposure or chemical manipulation. The grain structure remains consistent throughout, and the tonal values match perfectly with the surrounding elements. The shadow cast by the curtain fabric falls naturally across the intruding figure, which argues strongly against any post-processing addition to the image." He straightened and fixed Sir Reginald with that penetrating stare that had unnerved countless clients and criminals alike. "You are absolutely certain that this gap in the curtains and the face visible through it were not present when you first examined the photograph yesterday evening?" "I stake my reputation upon it," Sir Reginald replied with desperate conviction. I spent the better part of an hour admiring the quality of the print, examining every detail. The curtains were completely closed, showing no gap whatsoever, and certainly no face. I locked the photograph in my study overnight, and when I retrieved it this morning to arrange for framing, I discovered it exactly as you see it now. Holmes began pacing our small sitting room with that restless energy that always signaled his mind working at full capacity. "Tell me of the photographer who executed this commission. When did he arrive at your manor? How long did the session require? And what became of him afterward?" "He came highly recommended by Lord Pemberton, whose family portrait caused quite a sensation in the society pages last month. A foreign gentleman, I believe, though that he spoke perfect English. He arrived punctually at 3:30 with his equipment, arranged us in the library, as you see, and departed immediately after taking the single exposure. The entire process required perhaps 40 minutes, including the time needed to position his camera and adjust the lighting to his satisfaction." "And the glass plate negative?" "Remains in his possession, naturally. He was to deliver additional prints for the family within the week." Holmes ceased his pacing and turned to face us both, his grey eyes blazing with that peculiar intensity that marked the beginning of his most challenging cases. "Watson, I fear your breakfast must be postponed indefinitely. We are dealing with either a phenomenon that challenges our understanding of photographic chemistry or a human agency of remarkable sophistication and malicious intent." He reached for his coat and deerstalker with decisive movements. "Sir Reginald, we must examine your study immediately, while any traces of this impossible transformation remain fresh. The fog may obscure London's streets, but it will not prevent us from illuminating this mystery." As Holmes donned his Inverness cape, I could see his mind already racing ahead to the investigation that awaited us. The photograph lay upon our table, that sinister face seeming to watch us from behind the glass, and I felt an unaccountable sense of foreboding. Whatever forces had conspired to alter this image in the darkness of the previous night, they had chosen their method with calculated precision to inspire maximum terror. The question that remained was whether we were dealing with an elaborate hoax designed to frighten Sir Reginald's family, or something far more dangerous that threatened the safety of his daughter. The journey to Blackwood Manor through the fog-shrouded streets would provide time to consider the possibilities, but I could already sense from Holmes's demeanour that this case would test even his remarkable powers of deduction. As we prepared to depart Baker Street, the mysterious photograph seemed to mock us with its impossible transformation, a challenge thrown down by an unknown adversary who had chosen to wage war through the medium of light and shadow captured on silver salts. The fog had thickened considerably by the time our hansom cab turned through the wrought-iron gates of Blackwood Manor, transforming the November afternoon into something resembling twilight. The journey from Baker Street had been accomplished in relative silence, Holmes lost in contemplation, while Sir Reginald fidgeted nervously with the leather portfolio containing that impossible photograph. Through the cab's windows, I watched the urban landscape give way to the more spacious environs of Richmond, where ancient oaks loomed like spectral sentinels through the yellow murk. Blackwood Manor emerged from the mist with the sudden drama of a stage revelation, its Georgian facade of weathered stone speaking of generations of accumulated wealth and social position. The house commanded an impressive prospect, its numerous windows reflecting the weak afternoon light, while formal gardens stretched away into the fog-shrouded distance. A butler of dignified bearing awaited us at the columned entrance, his expression betraying nothing of surprise at our unexpected arrival, despite the lateness of the hour. "Hendricks has been with our family for 30 years, Sir Reginald explained as we were ushered through a spacious entrance hall adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. I would trust him implicitly, as I would all my household staff. The suggestion that any of them could be involved in this grotesque business is simply inconceivable." Holmes made no reply, but I observed his sharp gaze cataloguing every detail of our surroundings as we proceeded along a corridor toward the eastern wing of the house. The study proved to be exactly as depicted in the mysterious photograph, a masculine sanctuary of leather-bound volumes and polished mahogany, where the lingering scent of pipe tobacco spoke of countless quiet evenings spent in scholarly pursuits. Holmes moved immediately to examine the heavy velvet curtains that had featured so prominently in our investigation, his long fingers testing the fabric, while his keen eyes searched for any sign of disturbance. "These curtains have remained undisturbed since the portrait session?" he inquired, producing his magnifying lens to examine the carpet beneath the window with characteristic thoroughness. "Precisely as you see them," Sir Reginald confirmed. "The room has been locked since that day, opened only when I required a book or wished to sit by the fire." Holmes rose from his examination and drew the curtains aside with a swift motion, revealing the tall French windows that looked out upon a stone terrace. The windows were indeed secured from the interior by an iron latch that showed no signs of tampering. Yet Holmes tested it carefully before stepping out into the damp November air. The fog pressed close around us as we followed him onto the terrace, where he immediately knelt to examine the stone flags with his lens. "Most illuminating," he murmured, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness. "Watson, observe these faint scratches near the base of the window frame, and here this minute trace of what appears to be paraffin wax. Someone has stood here recently, positioning equipment with considerable care to avoid leaving obvious traces." I peered at the barely visible marks he indicated, noting how they formed a pattern consistent with tripod legs being hastily positioned. "But surely," I ventured, "if someone stood here during the portrait session, they would have been visible through the glass, even with the curtains drawn." "An astute observation," Holmes replied, straightening to his full height. "Yet the evidence suggests otherwise. We are dealing with a deception of remarkable sophistication, one that required precise timing and coordination." He stepped back into the study, securing the window latch behind him. "Sir Reginald, this photographer who executed the commission you mentioned, he worked entirely alone?" He was most insistent upon that point, claiming that assistants interfere with his artistic process. He carried all his equipment himself and seemed quite particular about his methods. "And during the session itself, did he leave the room at any point?" Sir Reginald's brow furrowed in concentration. "Now that you mention it, he did step out briefly just before taking the exposure. He claimed to have left his lens cap in the entrance hall. Victoria and I remained here, ensuring her gown was properly arranged." Holmes's eyes blazed with sudden interest. "How long was he absent?" "Perhaps 5 minutes?" "No more." Before Holmes could respond, the study door opened to admit a young woman whose striking beauty was marred by obvious distress. She possessed her father's dark hair, but with a delicate femininity that was entirely her own, and her pale complexion spoke of sleepless nights since the photograph's mysterious transformation. "Father," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I heard voices. Have you discovered what caused the picture to change?" Holmes bowed with characteristic courtesy. "Miss Blackwood, I am Sherlock Holmes. Pray tell me, did you notice anything unusual during the portrait session? Any sound from outside, perhaps?" Victoria hesitated, her fingers worrying the fabric of her dress. "I thought I heard a faint tapping at the window, like a branch striking the glass. But the curtains were drawn, and the photographer instructed me to remain perfectly still, so I didn't turn to investigate." "And how did the photographer react to this sound?" "He coughed quite loudly at precisely that moment, almost as though to cover the noise. I thought it merely coincidental." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me, and I saw the familiar light of understanding beginning to dawn in his grey eyes. The pieces of this elaborate puzzle were finally beginning to arrange themselves into a comprehensible pattern, though the ultimate purpose behind such an intricate deception remained tantalizingly obscure. Holmes regarded Miss Blackwood with that peculiar intensity he reserved for witnesses whose testimony might prove crucial, though I detected in his manner a gentleness that spoke well of his character, despite his frequent claims to the contrary. The young woman stood beside her father's chair, her hands clasped tightly before her, and I could see that she struggled with some internal conflict before finally speaking. "The face in the photograph," she began hesitantly, "though distorted and terrible as it appears, bears a resemblance to someone I once knew. A gentleman named Julian Harrow, who was persistent in his attention some 3 years past." She glanced nervously at her father before continuing. "Father forbade him the house when certain irregularities in his character came to light, and shortly afterward we received word that he had perished in a boating accident while attempting to flee his creditors across the channel." Sir Reginald's expression darkened considerably. Harrow was a scoundrel of the worst sort, though he presented himself as a gentleman of breeding. When I discovered his true nature, the gambling debts, the forged documents, the lies he told to gain entry into respectable society, I had no choice but to protect my daughter from his influence. His supposed death was a relief, though I confess the body was never recovered. Holmes began pacing the length of the study with that restless energy that always signaled his mind working at full capacity. The absence of a body is indeed significant, though not necessarily in the manner you might suppose. Tell me, Miss Blackwood, did this Harrow possess any particular skills or knowledge that might prove relevant to our current predicament? "He claimed to be an artist," she replied, "though I never saw evidence of any genuine talent. He spoke often of photography, claiming it would revolutionize portraiture, and he seemed unusually knowledgeable about the technical aspects of the craft." "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, his grey eyes blazing with sudden interest. "The pieces begin to arrange themselves into a comprehensible pattern. Watson, observe the sophistication required to execute this deception." The photographer, whether Harrow in disguise or an accomplice, needed to coordinate his actions with someone positioned outside the window. The strategic cough served as a signal, allowing the face to appear at the precise moment of exposure while remaining undetected by the sitters. He moved to the window and demonstrated the sight lines with characteristic precision. The gap in the curtains was created deliberately, though so subtly that neither of you noticed. A slight adjustment during the photographer's supposed search for his lens cap would have sufficed. The individual outside needed only to position himself correctly and wait for the signal. Sir Reginald sank into his chair, the full implications of Holmes's deduction clearly weighing upon him. "Then someone has been watching this house, studying our routines, planning this elaborate torment with methodical precision." "Indeed," Holmes replied grimly, "which suggests that this photograph is merely the opening gambit in a larger scheme. Watson, we must examine the photographer's studio immediately. If my suspicions prove correct, we shall find evidence of far more than a simple desire for revenge." The journey back to London through the thickening fog provided ample time for contemplation, though Holmes remained largely silent, his sharp features set in concentration. When we finally reached the address provided on the photographer's card, a narrow establishment on Kensington's Ambrose Place, we discovered a building that bore all the hallmarks of hasty abandonment. Holmes made short work of the lock with instruments I preferred not to examine too closely, and we stepped into the acrid atmosphere of a professional darkroom. The reception area showed signs of hurried departure, with overturned furniture and scattered papers, but the laboratory itself proved more revealing. Glass plates hung from drying racks, and the chemical baths still contained their pungent solutions. "Here, Watson," Holmes called, lifting a large glass negative to the light. "The original plate from Blackwood Manor, and observe. The face is clearly visible in the negative image. This confirms that the figure was present during the actual exposure, not added afterward through some photographic trickery." I examined the ghostly reversed image, noting how the pale face appeared as a dark shadow against the lighter window. But Sir Reginald insisted that the first print he saw showed no such face. "How do you account for that discrepancy?" Holmes's expression grew troubled as he continued searching the dark room. Near an overturned wastebasket, he discovered a crumpled letter bearing yesterday's date. He smoothed it carefully and read aloud. "The plan proceeds as arranged. The old man suspects nothing of our true purpose. Once the photograph produces the desired shock, we shall make our demands clear. Ensure the face appears sufficiently menacing to achieve maximum effect. The engagement must be broken or the consequences will be severe. V." "V?" I exclaimed. "Surely not Victoria herself?" "Or perhaps someone whose name begins with that letter," Holmes mused, though his tone lacked conviction. He studied the abandoned laboratory with renewed suspicion, his keen gaze cataloguing every detail. "This is too convenient, Watson. Criminals capable of executing such an elaborate visual deception do not typically leave incriminating correspondence lying about for investigators to discover." He set the letter aside and began examining the chemical apparatus with meticulous care. "The entire scene has been staged for our benefit. Someone anticipated that we would trace the photographer to this location and wanted us to find specific evidence that points toward blackmail and a mysterious accomplice identified only as V. We are being led by the nose, my dear fellow, and I suspect that the true architect of this scheme remains safely ensconced at Blackwood Manor, laughing at our predictable response to his carefully planted clues." The implications of Holmes's observation sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the November fog pressing against the windows. If he was correct, then we were dealing with an adversary of exceptional cunning, one who had anticipated our every move and prepared accordingly. The photograph with its sinister face was not the crime itself, but merely the opening move in a game whose true objectives remained hidden from us. Holmes gathered the glass negative and the suspicious letter, his movements sharp with barely contained frustration. "We return to Blackwood Manor immediately, Watson. I fear that while we have been chasing shadows in London, the real danger has been circling ever closer to Miss Blackwood. The photograph was designed not merely to frighten, but to draw us away from the manor at a crucial moment. We have been outmaneuvered, but the game is far from over." The return journey to Blackwood Manor through the thickening fog seemed interminable, our cab crawling through the yellow murk, while Holmes sat rigid with barely contained urgency. He turned the glass negative over in his long fingers, studying its ghostly reversed image as though it might yield secrets invisible in the positive print. The crumpled letter lay beside him, and I could see his mind working at full capacity, piecing together the fragments of an increasingly complex puzzle. "Watson," he said at length, his voice cutting through the rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestones. "Consider the psychology of our adversary. He has gone to extraordinary lengths to create an atmosphere of supernatural dread, yet the entire enterprise rests upon perfectly rational photographic principles. This is a man who values theatrical effect above all else, who takes pride in his cleverness and cannot resist demonstrating his superiority over those he considers his intellectual inferiors." I confessed that the criminal's methods seemed unnecessarily elaborate for simple blackmail. Surely a threatening letter would accomplish the same end with far less risk of exposure. Precisely the point, Holmes replied with grim satisfaction. Our criminal seeks to establish himself as someone possessing powers that defy natural law, thereby making his threats more potent. Yet in doing so he reveals much about his character. Such vanity often proves fatal to criminal enterprises, for it compels the perpetrator to continue escalating his demonstrations until he overreaches himself. We found Blackwood Manor blazing with light from nearly every window, creating an island of illumination against the fog-shrouded landscape. Something in that excessive brightness struck me as ominous, as though the household had armed itself against encroaching shadows with every available lamp and candle. Hendricks met us at the entrance with barely concealed agitation, his usual dignified composure shattered by obvious distress. "Thank Providence you have returned, Mr. Holmes," he exclaimed, abandoning all pretense of formal reserve. "Another envelope was delivered not 20 minutes after your departure, though no messenger was observed. It appeared upon the silver tray as though brought by invisible hands, and its contents have thrown the household into complete disorder." Holmes seized the proffered envelope before the butler had finished speaking, extracting a second photograph smaller than the first, but equally disturbing in its implications. This image showed Victoria Blackwood seated alone in the study, though the angle differed slightly from the original portrait. Behind her chair stood a shadowy figure, barely discernible against the bookcases, yet unmistakably human in its posture of proprietary menace. "Turn it over, Watson," Holmes commanded tersely. On the reverse, in precise copperplate script, were written the words, "The dead watch over those who betray them. The engagement must end, or the next visitation shall not be confined to paper." The message bore a single initial, this time not V, but J. Sir Reginald appeared at that moment, his face haggard with worry, and his earlier composure completely abandoned. "Julian Harrow," he whispered hoarsely. "The scoundrel lives, just as I feared he might. But how is this possible? How can he appear in photographs taken within my own locked study?" Holmes had already moved past him toward the study itself, his movements sharp with purpose. He examined the envelope with his pocket lens, then produced a small bottle containing colourless fluid, which he applied to the paper's surface with a camel hair brush. Pale, ghostly letters slowly appeared beneath the chemical's influence. "Most illuminating," he murmured. The envelope was originally addressed to Lady Amelia Blackwood, the Priory, Ashbourne. It has been repurposed from old correspondence, suggesting our adversary has access not merely to your present household, but to relics of your past life, old letters, perhaps stored in attics or family archives. He strode into the study and positioned himself precisely where Victoria had stood during the portrait session 3 days before. His grey eyes swept the room with that remarkable focus I had witnessed countless times, cataloguing every detail with mechanical precision. Suddenly, his gaze fixed upon the bookshelf that occupied the wall adjacent to the window. "Watson, observe the positioning," he said, moving to examine the carved woodwork. Miss Blackwood mentioned hearing a tapping at the window during the portrait session. But what if that sound came not from outside, but from within these very walls? His fingers explored the bookshelf's ornate moulding, and within moments he had located a concealed mechanism. The entire section swung outward to reveal a narrow passage leading into darkness. "A priest-hole," Holmes announced with satisfaction, dating from the house's construction during the religious persecutions of the 16th century. The photographer's accomplice did not stand outside the window at all, but rather within this passage, pressing his face against the glass from the interior side. That explains why no footprints were found on the terrace, why the window remained locked, and why the face appeared so distinctly despite the drawn curtains. Sir Reginald stared at the revealed passage in astonishment. I had no knowledge of such a thing. My father never mentioned it, nor did any member of the household staff in 30 years of service. Yet someone knew of its existence and used it to devastating effect, Holmes replied grimly. He produced his electric torch and plunged into the passage without hesitation, with myself and Sir Reginald following close behind. The narrow corridor descended steeply through ancient stonework, the air growing progressively colder and damper as we advanced into the manor's foundations. The passage terminated in a heavy wooden door secured by an iron bolt. Holmes drew it back carefully, and we emerged into the chill November night, somewhere on the manor grounds, the fog pressing close around us like a living entity. Through the murk, I could discern the dark outline of a structure near the river's edge, and from within it came the faint glow of lamplight. "The old boathouse," Sir Reginald whispered. "It has stood empty for years, ever since the accident that claimed my wife's life upon these very waters." Holmes raised his hand for silence, his acute hearing detecting something that escaped our notice. Then I heard it too. Voices raised in heated discussion, one unmistakably feminine, despite the muffling effect of fog and distance. Without another word, Holmes began moving toward the structure with that peculiar gliding motion he employed when stealth was paramount. As we approached the weathered building, I could make out fragments of conversation through its rotting timbers. A woman's voice, strained with emotion, was pleading desperately, while a man's responses carried the cold mockery I had learned to associate with criminal arrogance. Holmes positioned himself beside a gap in the wall-boards, peering through with infinite caution before gesturing for us to join him. The scene within confirmed our worst fears while simultaneously revealing the true scope of the deception that had been practiced upon us. Victoria Blackwood sat bound to a chair in the centre of the decrepit structure, her face pale but determined, while before her stood not the resurrected Julian Harrow, but a figure whose identity would soon reshape our entire understanding of this elaborate conspiracy. Holmes's hand closed upon my arm with iron strength, and I knew that the moment of revelation was finally at hand. The game of shadows and misdirection was about to end, but not in any manner we could have anticipated when we first examined that impossible photograph in the comfort of Baker Street. Through the gap in the weathered planks, the lamplight within the boathouse revealed a scene that struck me with profound shock. The man standing before the bound Victoria Blackwood was not some mysterious stranger or the phantom Julian Harrow, but rather a figure whose presence here defied all reasonable expectation. Lord Edward Ashworth himself, Victoria's own fiancé, though his customary expression of aristocratic refinement had been replaced by something far more sinister. He held a small revolver with casual familiarity, and his voice carried none of the warmth I had observed during their engagement announcement. "You understand now why our arrangement must be dissolved," he was saying, his tone bearing the patient condescension one might employ with a particularly obstinate child. "Your father's investigation into my family's financial affairs has uncovered certain irregularities that would prove most inconvenient if brought to public attention. The photographs were merely meant to frighten him into withdrawing his scrutiny, but you had to involve Sherlock Holmes." Victoria's response, though muffled by her bonds, held a courage that commanded my admiration. When Ashworth loosened her gag to hear her reply, she spoke with remarkable steadiness. "Edward, this madness must end. Whatever difficulties you face, surely there are legitimate means of addressing them without resorting to such desperate measures." Lord Ashworth's laugh carried no trace of genuine mirth. Legitimate means are luxuries afforded only to those who possess sufficient wealth to maintain their appearance. My family's fortune has been systematically depleted by 3 generations of incompetent stewardship. The engagement to you was meant to restore our position through your father's considerable dowry, but the old fool insisted on examining our accounts before finalizing the settlement. From the shadows at the rear of the boathouse, another figure emerged into the lamplight, and I recognized the gaunt features that had appeared so menacingly in the photograph. Julian Harrow was indeed alive, though his appearance suggested that years of exile had taken their toll upon both body and spirit. His movements carried the resigned weariness of a man who had lost all capacity for hope. "Lord Ashworth discovered my whereabouts 6 months ago," Harrow said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He knew of my history with your family and assumed I would leap at the chance for revenge. What he failed to understand was that my supposed death had granted me something far more valuable than vengeance, the opportunity to disappear entirely from my former life of debt and disgrace." Holmes chose that precise moment to step through the boathouse entrance, his tall figure materializing from the fog with theatrical precision. "Yet you participated in the deception nonetheless, Mr. Harrow. The face in the window, the elaborate coordination during the portrait session, these required your active cooperation, however reluctant." Lord Ashworth spun toward us, his revolver rising with alarming speed, but Holmes had anticipated the movement. With a swift gesture, he sent his walking stick spinning through the air, striking the weapon from Ashworth's grasp before he could fire. The revolver clattered across the rotting floorboards as Sir Reginald burst through the entrance behind us, rushing immediately to free his daughter from her bonds. "How did you penetrate my carefully constructed deception, Mr. Holmes?" Ashworth demanded, his aristocratic composure cracking to reveal the desperate calculation beneath. "I took every precaution to ensure the trail would lead away from me." Holmes retrieved the fallen weapon while keeping his keen gaze fixed upon both conspirators. "Your vanity betrayed you, as it so often does, with criminals of intelligence. The camera used for the portrait session was of French manufacture, a rare model produced in limited quantities for professional studios. My inquiries revealed that you had purchased such a camera 3 months ago, claiming it was a gift for an artistic friend. No such friend exists in your social circle, as my investigation confirmed." He began pacing the confined space, his voice taking on that lecturing quality I knew so well. Moreover, the priest hole itself suggested intimate knowledge of Blackwood Manor's architecture, knowledge that a supposed stranger could not possess, but which would be readily available to Victoria's fiancé. You had access to the house, to the family's routines, and most crucially, to their trust. Sir Reginald had freed his daughter and now stood protectively beside her, his expression a mixture of rage and profound betrayal. "You courted my daughter with the sole intention of accessing my fortune to cover your family's debts. The photographs, the threats, all designed to manipulate me into proceeding with the engagement despite my discoveries." Harrow stepped forward, his shoulders sagging with the weight of confession. "I was coerced into participation through threats of exposure to my creditors. The debts I fled 3 years ago have only grown through accumulated interest. Lord Ashworth offered me a choice between cooperation and certain destruction." Holmes nodded grimly. "A most ingenious scheme, though fundamentally flawed in its execution. You underestimated both Sir Reginald's devotion to his daughter and the speed with which proper investigation would unravel your deception. The photographic evidence you created to inspire fear became the very instrument of your exposure. As I secured both prisoners with rope found among the boathouse equipment, I reflected upon the cruel irony that Victoria's own fiancé had orchestrated this campaign of terror against her family. The case had indeed tested Holmes's remarkable powers, revealing how even the most intimate relationships could conceal the darkest of intentions. The damp chill of the boathouse seemed to intensify as the full implications of our discovery settled upon the assembled group. Holmes remained standing over the bound Lord Ashworth, his grey eyes reflecting a cold fury that I had witnessed only when confronting the most despicable of criminals. Victoria, though freed from her physical bonds, appeared to struggle with the psychological chains of betrayal that bound her to a man whose true nature had been so thoroughly concealed. Sir Reginald's voice trembled with barely controlled rage as he addressed his daughter's former fiancé. "To think that I welcomed you into my home, trusted you with my most precious treasure, even began the process of settling a substantial dowry upon you, all while you plotted not merely theft, but murder." Ashworth's composure had cracked entirely, revealing the calculating predator beneath the aristocratic facade. "You speak of murder as though it were my intention from the beginning," he sneered, his cultured accent taking on a harder edge. "The plan evolved as circumstances demanded. Your insufferable scrutiny of my family's affairs left me no choice but to consider more permanent solutions." Holmes had been examining the additional photographic equipment with meticulous care, and now he straightened with an expression that sent ice through my veins. "Watson, observe these glass plates still wet from recent development. Lord Ashworth has been quite busy this evening, creating what I can only describe as a comprehensive record of his intended crime." He held up a series of plates to the lamplight, each more disturbing than the last. They showed Victoria in various poses, suggesting unconsciousness or death, positioned with the macabre artistry of a man who had studied such scenes extensively. The final plate showed the boathouse interior arranged as though for a suicide, complete with a noose fashioned from boat rope and a forged note in Victoria's handwriting. "My God," Sir Reginald whispered, his face draining of colour. "You intended to stage her suicide and claim the supernatural photographs had driven her to despair." "Quite ingenious, really," Holmes observed with clinical detachment, though his voice carried an undercurrent of disgust. "The haunted photographs would provide the motive. Miss Blackwood's supposed fragile feminine nature would make suicide plausible, and Lord Ashworth would emerge as the grieving fiancé, inheriting whatever settlement had already been arranged while remaining free to pursue another heiress." Julian Harrow, who had listened to these revelations in horrified silence, finally found his voice. "I swear upon my mother's grave that I knew nothing of this murderous intent. When Ashworth approached me with his scheme, he spoke only of frightening Sir Reginald into a more generous settlement. The photographs were meant to be harmless tricks, nothing more." Holmes turned his penetrating gaze upon Harrow, and I saw something approaching sympathy in his expression. "I believe you speak the truth, Mr. Harrow. You were as much a victim of Lord Ashworth's manipulation as anyone else, though your own desperation made you susceptible to his influence." Victoria had been studying the photographs with a strange fascination, as though trying to comprehend how close she had come to death. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a strength that belied her ordeal. "Edward, how long have you been planning this? The courtship, the engagement, all of it. Was any of it genuine?" Ashworth's laugh held no trace of warmth. "You were always a means to an end, my dear Victoria. Your father's wealth represented salvation for my family's fortunes, and when that salvation was threatened by his investigations, I simply adapted my methods. Sentiment is a luxury I could not afford." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted this grim confession, and Holmes moved swiftly to secure the incriminating photographs. "That will be the local constabulary, summoned by Hendricks at my instruction. Watson, ensure that these plates are carefully preserved as evidence. They will prove crucial in establishing the premeditated nature of Lord Ashworth's crimes." As we waited for the authorities to assume custody of our prisoners, Holmes continued his examination of the boathouse with that relentless thoroughness that characterized all his investigations. Near a pile of rotting canvas, he discovered a leather satchel containing additional items that spoke to the elaborate nature of the conspiracy. "Forged correspondence in Miss Blackwood's hand," he announced, withdrawing several sheets of paper. "Practice attempts by the evidence of the varying quality, and here a detailed floor plan of Blackwood Manor, including notations about the servants' routines and the location of the family safe. Lord Ashworth, your preparations were indeed comprehensive." The arrival of Constable Briggs and his men brought a welcome sense of official authority to the proceedings, though I noted Holmes's reluctance to relinquish control of the investigation. He provided the constable with a succinct but thorough account of our discoveries, emphasizing the serious nature of the charges that would need to be brought. As Lord Ashworth and Julian Harrow were led away in chains, Holmes drew me aside, his voice dropping to that confidential tone that always preceded some crucial insight. "Watson, this affair troubles me more deeply than I care to admit. We have exposed a conspiracy of remarkable complexity, yet I cannot shake the feeling that we have seen only the surface of something far more extensive." He gestured toward the manor house, its windows blazing with light against the pre-dawn darkness. "Consider the sophistication required to orchestrate these events, the knowledge of photographic techniques, the understanding of human psychology, the intimate familiarity with the Blackwood family's routines and vulnerabilities. Lord Ashworth possessed some of these capabilities, but not all. Someone else has been pulling strings from the shadows, and until we identify that individual, I fear the danger to this household has not entirely passed." The implications of Holmes's words settled upon me like a cold weight. If he was correct, then our apparent victory in the boathouse might prove to be merely the end of the first act in a larger drama. As we prepared to escort Sir Reginald and Victoria back to the safety of the manor, I found myself scanning the fog-shrouded landscape with new vigilance, wondering what other threats might be lurking in the darkness beyond our sight. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was far from over. And somewhere in the shadows, a master manipulator was undoubtedly already planning his next move in this deadly chess match where human lives served as pawns and the stakes grew higher with each passing hour. The return journey to Blackwood Manor through the dissipating fog possessed that peculiar unreality which sometimes follows moments of extreme peril. Dawn was beginning to leach the yellow murk from the November air, revealing the familiar landscape in shades of grey and amber that seemed to mock the darkness we had just confronted. Sir Reginald walked with his arm protectively around Victoria, whose step, though steady, betrayed the exhaustion of body and spirit that must inevitably follow such an ordeal. Holmes strode slightly ahead, his sharp profile etched against the paling sky. Yet his gaze remained fixed not upon the path before us, but upon some internal landscape of deduction and conjecture that clearly troubled him. The persistent unease. Inside the manor, Hendricks and the remaining servants clustered anxiously in the entrance hall, their evident relief at Victoria's safe return appearing quite genuine. Still, I noticed Holmes's keen eyes travel from face to face with that unerring scrutiny which seldom failed to pierce through even the most carefully constructed masks. When Victoria had been attended to and Sir Reginald had reluctantly agreed to seek some rest, Holmes drew me aside to the study, where that sinister photograph still lay upon the desk like an accusation. "Something continues to trouble you beyond the obvious," I observed, settling into the leather chair that had witnessed so much drama. "We have apprehended the criminals and prevented what would surely have been a tragic outcome. Yet you seem more agitated now than when we first examined that impossible photograph." Holmes began pacing before the fireplace with that restless energy that always signaled an unsolved problem gnawing at his remarkable intellect. "Consider the resources required to orchestrate this deception, Watson. The specialized French camera, the chemical supplies, the intimate knowledge of the manor's architecture. Lord Ashworth, in his impoverished state, could never have commanded such means. We have captured the instrument, but the hand that wielded it remains hidden." The financial trail. He withdrew the crumpled letter we had discovered in the abandoned darkroom, studying its contents with renewed scrutiny. "The handwriting troubled me from the moment I first examined it. The script is too perfect, too deliberately theatrical, yet beneath the disguise lie subtle characteristics that speak of education and breeding far above Ashworth's station." His grey eyes blazed with sudden intensity. "Watson, this conspiracy required not merely desperation but substantial financial backing from someone with both the means and the motivation to see the Blackwood family destroyed." Before I could respond, Hendricks appeared at the study door, his dignified bearing somewhat restored, though his eyes betrayed the strain of the night's revelations. "Mr. Holmes, forgive the interruption, but I thought you should know that Lady Amelia's private sitting room appears to have been disturbed. Several of her personal effects are missing, including correspondence from the years before her tragic death." Holmes was across the room in 3 swift strides. "Show me immediately and omit no detail of what you observed." The violated sanctuary. We followed the butler through the manor's corridors to a chamber in the western wing that had been preserved exactly as its occupant had left it 5 years previous. The room possessed that peculiar melancholy that clings to spaces abandoned by the dead, with dust covers shrouding furniture and the air carrying the faint scent of lavender sachets grown stale with time. Holmes examined the writing desk with meticulous care, noting the disturbed layer of dust and the forced lock on a small drawer that had once contained private papers. "The thief was searching for specific documents, not valuables," Holmes observed, indicating how the jewellery box remained untouched while every letter and journal had been removed. "Someone required samples of Lady Amelia's handwriting, her personal seal, perhaps even details of family financial arrangements that would not be common knowledge." He straightened suddenly, his expression transforming with the light of revelation. "Watson, who would possess both the detailed knowledge of this family's affairs and the social connections necessary to manipulate a desperate aristocrat like Lord Ashworth? Who would have intimate access to Lady Amelia's private correspondence and the financial resources to fund such an elaborate scheme?" The web revealed. The implications of his question were forming in my mind when the sound of carriage wheels upon gravel reached us through the morning air. Holmes moved swiftly to the window, his keen gaze taking in the approaching vehicle with its ducal coat of arms blazoned upon the door. "Most convenient timing," he murmured with grim satisfaction. The Duke of Montfort arrives to survey the wreckage of his handiwork. Watson, we must arrange a confrontation that will force him to reveal his hand. The game enters its final phase, and our opponent believes himself already victorious. As we prepared to return to the drawing room, Holmes paused to examine a piece of correspondence that had escaped the thief's attention. A brief note wedged behind the desk's secret compartment. The handwriting, though a tempting disguise, bore unmistakable similarities to the threatening letter from the photographer's studio. The loop of the Y, the pressure on the downstrokes, Holmes noted with satisfaction. Our mysterious benefactor has been more careless than he realized. The Duke of Montfort may have funded this conspiracy, but he could not resist the temptation to direct its execution personally. Such vanity will prove his undoing. The morning light streaming through the sitting-room windows seemed to illuminate not merely the dust motes dancing in the air, but the entire web of deception that had been spun around the Blackwood family. As we prepared to confront the true architect of these crimes, I reflected that Holmes had been correct from the beginning. The photograph that changed overnight had been merely the opening gambit in a far more sinister game, one whose ultimate stakes were nothing less than the complete destruction of an innocent family's peace and prosperity. The sound of voices from the drawing-room below indicated that our final confrontation was about to begin, and with it the unmasking of a villain whose crimes had been hidden behind the respectability of ancient title and social position. We descended to the drawing-room to find Sir Reginald standing with rigid formality near the hearth, his features composed into that mask of courtesy which English gentlemen employ when confronting those they secretly mistrust. Opposite him, having just been announced by Hendricks, stood the Duke of Montfort, a man whose imposing presence seemed to command the very air around him, tall and broad-shouldered, with iron-grey hair, and features that spoke of generations of unquestioned authority. He warmed his hands before the fire with the casual proprietorship of one accustomed to treating all spaces as extensions of his own domain. Despite the early hour, the Duke was immaculately attired in morning dress of the finest cut, his bearing radiating that peculiar mixture of arrogance and ennui which marks the hereditary peerage. Upon our entrance, he turned with deliberate slowness, his heavy-lidded eyes sweeping over us with an expression of mild distaste that lingered noticeably upon Holmes's somewhat dishevelled appearance following our night's exertions. "Reginald," the Duke intoned, his voice carrying the deep resonance of one accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I was informed by my gamekeeper that the local constabulary had been summoned to your grounds. Given the distressing rumours regarding the supernatural visitations and that unfortunate business with young Ashworth, I felt it my duty as your neighbour and oldest friend to offer my assistance in these trying circumstances." Sir Reginald accepted the proffered hand with what appeared to be genuine gratitude, though I detected a subtle tension in his manner. "Your Grace is most considerate. It has indeed been a night of horrors, though I am relieved to say the immediate danger has passed. Mr. Holmes here has exposed a conspiracy of remarkable wickedness involving my daughter's former fiancé." The Duke's gaze settled upon Holmes with an expression of polite scepticism. "Ah, yes, the consulting detective whose exploits Dr. Watson chronicles with such theatrical flourish. I confess I find the accounts somewhat sensationalized, though I suppose they provide adequate entertainment for the masses. One wonders why Scotland Yard requires such amateur assistance in matters of genuine criminality." Holmes moved further into the room, his demeanour shifting with that subtle transformation I had witnessed countless times before, from weary investigator to sharp, predatory intelligence. "The official force, Your Grace, is often constrained by the need for tangible evidence and established procedure, whereas I am free to follow the threads of logic wherever they may lead, even when they lead to the most exalted circles of society." The atmosphere in the drawing-room tightened perceptibly, like the air before a thunderstorm. The Duke's smile remained fixed upon his aristocratic features, but his eyes grew noticeably colder. "I assume you have some specific point to make, Mr. Holmes, or is this merely a theatrical display designed to justify whatever fee you have extracted from my unfortunate neighbour?" I rarely charge a fee when the intellectual satisfaction of the case provides reward enough, Holmes replied, moving to position himself near the writing desk where the incriminating documents lay. We have just dispatched Lord Ashworth and his accomplice, Mr. Harrow, to the county jail, though I confess the affair troubled me with its sophistication. Ashworth was indeed a desperate man, drowning in debts and willing to attempt any scheme to secure the Blackwood fortune. Yet what puzzled me was the remarkable quality of his tools and intelligence. Holmes produced the French camera's documentation from his coat pocket. This photographic apparatus, for instance, a marvel of Parisian engineering costing more than Lord Ashworth's entire annual allowance. My inquiries at London's photographic supply houses revealed that such a camera was purchased 3 months ago by a gentleman whose description matched your own precisely, Your Grace. The transaction was conducted under an assumed name, but the proprietor's memory for faces proved quite reliable when presented with your photograph from the society pages. The Duke's composure wavered almost imperceptibly, though he maintained his air of bored superiority. You place considerable faith in the testimony of some tradesman seeking to inflate his own importance. If that constitutes the extent of your evidence— On the contrary, Holmes interrupted smoothly, the physical evidence proves far more compelling than mere witness testimony. You see, I have spent considerable time this morning examining the handwriting samples found throughout this conspiracy. He produced the crumpled letter from the photographer's studio alongside a formal invitation bearing the ducal seal. It is a singular fact that certain distinctive characteristics, the loop of the letter Y, the pressure on downstrokes, the peculiar flourish on R, remain consistent despite obvious attempts at disguise. Your hand betrays you as surely as a fingerprint, Your Grace. Sir Reginald had grown very still, his gaze moving between Holmes and his distinguished visitor with dawning comprehension. Montfort, what is the meaning of this? Why would you involve yourself in such a scheme? Holmes continued his methodical presentation before the Duke could respond. The answer lies in a combination of financial desperation and personal obsession spanning decades. My investigations in the city revealed that the Montfort estates have been systematically bankrupted through disastrous speculations in South American railways. You held the majority of Lord Ashworth's promissory notes, Your Grace. His marriage to the Blackwood heiress would have solved both your financial difficulties simultaneously. The Duke's face had begun to flush with angry colour, but Holmes pressed forward relentlessly. Yet, when Sir Reginald began investigating Ashworth's background, you realized the engagement was in jeopardy. You required a distraction, something to terrify Sir Reginald into compliance while maintaining your own position above suspicion. Hence, the elaborate photographic deception, designed to suggest supernatural persecution rather than human agency. Victoria had entered the room during this exchange, and she now stood beside her father with growing horror as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Holmes turned his penetrating gaze upon her before continuing. But the financial motive, compelling though it was, cannot fully explain the personal malice evident in this scheme. The desecration of family portraits, the violation of private spaces, the deliberate terrorizing of an innocent young woman, these speak to deeper, more personal hatred. Holmes moved to Lady Amelia's writing desk, withdrawing a bundle of yellowed correspondence. These letters, written 25 years ago before Lady Amelia's marriage to Sir Reginald, tell a most illuminating story. They record her rejection of your own proposal of marriage, Your Grace, delivered with a finality that clearly rankled through the decades. The Duke's aristocratic mask began to crack, revealing something harder and more desperate beneath. You presume much based on ancient history, Mr. Holmes. Even if such correspondence existed, which I neither confirm nor deny, it hardly constitutes evidence of criminal conspiracy. Perhaps not in isolation, Holmes agreed, but when combined with other evidence, it paints a picture of obsession that ultimately led to murder. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and horror. The boating accident that claimed Lady Amelia's life 5 years ago was no accident at all. I examined the old boathouse thoroughly, Your Grace. The rope that allegedly snapped under Lady Amelia's weight had been partially sawn through and carefully replaced to appear untampered with. Sir Reginald's face had gone white as parchment. "You cannot mean Amelia's death was deliberately arranged," Holmes confirmed gently. "Though I suspect the intended victim was yourself, Sir Reginald. The sabotage was meant to eliminate the man who had won Lady Amelia's heart, but fate intervened when she took the boat out alone that morning." The Duke's composure shattered completely, and for a moment I glimpsed the madness that had driven him to such elaborate vengeance. "She was everything to me," he whispered hoarsely. "And she chose you, a man of inferior breeding with nothing but recently acquired wealth to recommend him. I waited years, thinking time would reveal her mistake. But she loved you until her dying breath. That accident was meant for you, Blackwood, not her." The confession hung in the air like poison, and Victoria moved instinctively closer to her father as the full horror of the Duke's obsession became clear. Sir Reginald's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "You killed the woman you claimed to love, and then spent 5 years plotting to destroy her daughter as further revenge against me. What manner of monster have you become?" The Duke's laugh carried no trace of sanity. "I gave Ashworth everything he needed to succeed. The camera, the chemicals, the knowledge of your house's architectural secrets. I even provided him with Harrow, knowing the man's history would make him a perfect instrument of terror. But you had to involve Sherlock Holmes. Now everything has come to ruin." Holmes had already positioned himself between the Duke and the door, anticipating any attempt at flight. "Your Grace, you stand accused not merely of conspiracy and blackmail, but of murder most foul. I have already summoned Inspector Lestrade, and I believe I hear his approach even now." The sound of approaching footsteps confirmed Holmes's words, and moments later Inspector Lestrade entered with 2 constables, his sharp features bearing an expression of grim satisfaction. "Your Grace," he announced formally, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, blackmail, and accessory to attempted homicide. You will accompany us to London immediately." The Duke drew himself up with the last remnants of his aristocratic dignity. "You presume to lay hands upon a peer of the realm?" Lestrade's response carried all the authority of British law. "I presume to execute my duty, Your Grace. Justice recognizes no distinction between dukes and dustmen, and thanks to Mr. Holmes's investigation, we have evidence enough to satisfy any court in the land." As the constables secured the Duke's hands with iron restraints, Holmes observed the scene with that peculiar mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that always marked the conclusion of his most challenging cases. The morning sun, streaming through the drawing-room windows, seemed to illuminate not merely the assembled figures, but the entire tragic architecture of obsession and revenge that had nearly claimed another innocent life. The photograph that had changed overnight had indeed been the opening gambit in a deadly game, but it was a game whose final moves would now be played out in the dock at the Old Bailey, where the Duke of Montfort would face the consequences of allowing wounded pride and unrequited passion to transform him from nobleman into monster. The removal of the Duke of Montfort from Blackwood Manor left behind a peculiar stillness, as though the very walls were slowly exhaling the poison that had accumulated within them over so many troubled years. The morning sun, now fully risen above the dissipating fog, streamed through the tall windows of the drawing-room with a clarity that seemed almost harsh after the shadows and deceptions of the previous night. Sir Reginald stood motionless before the hearth, his weathered features bearing the weight of revelations that had transformed friend into murderer and accident into deliberate malice. Victoria occupied the window seat where she had so often sat as a child, though her posture now reflected a maturity born of surviving betrayal and attempted murder. Her hands lay folded in her lap with perfect composure, yet I observed the slight tremor that betrayed the emotional toll of discovering that her own fiancé had orchestrated her terrorization. Holmes moved through the room with characteristic restlessness, gathering the scattered evidence of the conspiracy with meticulous care, arranging each piece as though constructing a final monument to human duplicity. "Mr. Holmes," Sir Reginald said at length, his voice carrying the hollow quality of a man forced to reassess 20 years of friendship, "I find myself in the extraordinary position of owing you my daughter's life while simultaneously wishing you had never revealed the truth about my beloved Amelia's death. For 5 years I have mourned her as the victim of tragic accident, finding some small comfort in fate's randomness. Now I must live with the knowledge that she was murdered by a man I welcomed into this very room, killed in a plot originally intended for me." Holmes ceased his methodical arrangement of documents and turned to face our host with an expression that revealed more sympathy than he typically allowed himself to display. "The truth, Sir Reginald, however agonizing, provides the only foundation upon which genuine healing may occur. Your wife's death was not your fault, though I comprehend the burden of survivor's guilt that accompanies such knowledge. The Duke's obsession predated your courtship by many years and would have found expression regardless of your actions or choices." The young woman rose from her position by the window and moved to stand beside her father, placing a steadying hand upon his arm. "Papa, Mr. Holmes speaks truly. The monster who orchestrated these horrors bears sole responsibility for his crimes. We cannot permit his madness to poison our memories of Mama or our hopes for whatever future remains to us." Holmes regarded Victoria with that rare gentleness he reserved for those who had earned his genuine respect. "Miss Blackwood, your courage throughout this ordeal has been nothing short of exemplary. Lesser individuals might have succumbed to hysteria or despair when confronted with seemingly supernatural terrors, yet you maintained your composure even when that cursed photograph suggested forces beyond rational explanation." He moved to the desk where the incriminating evidence lay arranged like exhibits in some macabre museum. For the case presented several features of unusual interest, particularly the sophisticated marriage of ancient grudges with modern photographic science. Once we understood the psychology driving each participant, Lord Ashworth's desperate vanity, Mr. Harrow's coerced compliance, and the Duke's festering obsession, the physical evidence arranged itself with mathematical precision. Sir Reginald lifted his gaze from the flames to fix it upon Holmes with evident curiosity. "But how could you possibly deduce the connection between a simple altered photograph and a murder plotted 5 years past? What led you to suspect that Amelia's death was anything other than the tragic accident it appeared?" Holmes produced his pipe and began the familiar ritual of filling it with tobacco, his movements deliberate as he organized his thoughts. The handwriting provided the crucial link, revealing the Duke's involvement despite his attempts at disguise. Yet beyond that technical evidence, the very nature of the crimes, their theatricality, their intimate cruelty, their precise knowledge of your family's most private vulnerabilities, pointed unmistakably to someone driven by personal malice rather than mere financial desperation. Lord Ashworth sought money, certainly, but the mastermind behind him sought nothing less than your complete destruction. Without ceremony, Holmes lifted the original photograph from the desk, studying the sinister face that peered from behind the curtains one final time. "I recommend you consign this abomination to the flames, Sir Reginald. The glass negative remains in police custody as evidence for the Duke's trial, but this print serves no purpose beyond perpetuating his malicious intent." Sir Reginald accepted the photograph with hands that trembled slightly, gazing upon the image that had brought such terror to his household. Without hesitation he cast it into the fire, and we watched in profound silence as the flames consumed the elaborate deception, reducing months of careful planning to ash and smoke. The destruction of that cursed image seemed to lift some invisible burden from the room itself, as though the manor could finally draw a clean breath after holding it through days of mounting dread. As Holmes began gathering his coat and deerstalker in preparation for our departure, Sir Reginald grasped his hand with unmistakable emotion. "Whatever fee you require for your services, Mr. Holmes, I shall gladly pay without question. You have not merely saved my daughter's life, but exposed a murderer who might otherwise have escaped earthly justice entirely." Holmes waved away the offer with his customary dismissiveness, though I detected a warmth in his manner that suggested genuine affection for this family he had served. The intellectual satisfaction of unravelling so complex a puzzle provides reward sufficient unto itself. However, I would venture to suggest that you might consider establishing some charitable foundation in Lady Amelia's memory, perhaps focused upon assisting young women in circumstances of financial vulnerability. Such an endeavour would honour her memory far more meaningfully than any payment to me. The suggestion clearly resonated with both father and daughter, and I observed the first glimmers of renewed purpose beginning to replace the shock and grief that had dominated their expressions throughout the morning. As we took our final leave of Blackwood Manor, climbing into the waiting hansom for our return journey to London, I reflected upon the case's resolution with feelings both of satisfaction and profound melancholy. The photograph that had changed overnight had indeed proven to be the key that unlocked a conspiracy of remarkable depth and malice, yet the human cost of that conspiracy, a murdered woman, a violated friendship, a young woman's shattered trust in those closest to her, could never be fully remedied by justice alone. Holmes sat beside me in contemplative silence as our cab rolled through the brightening countryside, and I knew that despite his protestations of cold logic and emotional detachment, he too felt the weight of what we had witnessed in the shadow-haunted corridors of that ancient house. "A singular case, Watson," he remarked at length, as the familiar outlines of London began to emerge through the clearing air. The marriage of modern photographic science with ancient passions produced a puzzle of unusual complexity. Yet, as so often proves the case, human vanity provided the thread that, when pulled, unravelled the entire fabric of deception. As we ascended the familiar 17 steps to our rooms at Baker Street, Holmes paused at the landing window to gaze out over the fog-dimmed street below. "You may chronicle this affair if you wish, my dear fellow, but I suggest you title it not for the wickedness we exposed, but for the illusion that first brought it to our attention. Let it stand as a reminder that even photography, which men increasingly trust as the very imprint of objective truth, may lie as completely as any human witness when cunning hands manipulate the apparatus behind the lens." With those words, he cast aside his travelling coat, reached for his long-suffering violin, and drew from its strings a series of low, contemplative notes that seemed to weave together all the threads of tragedy and justice we had just witnessed. I took up my pen with renewed purpose, knowing that another singular chapter in the career of Sherlock Holmes had drawn to its close, and that somewhere in the great sprawling metropolis around us, the next mystery was already quietly taking shape in the shadows where reason and madness eternally contend for dominion over the human heart. The weeks following the Duke of Montfort's arrest brought swift justice to all parties involved in the conspiracy. The trial at the Old Bailey became a sensation that dominated London society, the spectacle of a peer standing accused of murder providing endless fascination for the public. Lord Ashworth and Julian Harrow both provided testimony in exchange for reduced sentences, their confessions filling the final gaps in the Crown's case against the Duke. Holmes appeared only once as a witness, his precise recitation of the photographic evidence and handwriting analysis proving devastating to the defence. The jury required mere hours to return a guilty verdict, and the judge's sentencing remarks spoke eloquently of how no social position could shield one from justice's reach. Sir Reginald proved faithful to Holmes's suggestion, establishing the Amelia Blackwood Foundation to assist young women of limited means. Victoria herself took active management of the charity, channeling her considerable strength into work that honoured her mother's memory while providing tangible benefit to others. I received occasional letters chronicling the family's gradual healing from their ordeal. On a particularly dreary December evening, as snow began falling upon Baker Street, I ventured to ask Holmes whether he felt satisfaction at having exposed crimes hidden for so many years. He set aside his chemical treatise and regarded me with that penetrating gaze I knew so well. "Satisfaction, Watson, may be too strong a term," he replied thoughtfully. "We prevented one murder and exposed another, bringing justice to those who suffered grievous wrongs. Yet the human cost, a woman dead these 5 years, a family's peace destroyed by one man's inability to accept rejection, these losses can never be fully remedied by legal proceedings." He moved to the window, watching the snowflakes drift down upon the gaslit street. The Duke possessed every advantage society could bestow, yet he allowed wounded vanity to transform him into something monstrous. That transformation occurred not in a moment of madness, but through years of nurturing grievances until murder itself appeared justified. Holmes turned from the window with that mixture of weariness and determination that characterized his approach to his singular profession. Yet the work provides its own reward. Each case solved represents a victory for reason over chaos. The photograph that seemed to change overnight appeared to defy natural law, but it yielded readily enough to methodical investigation once we understood the human agencies behind the illusion. As Holmes returned to his experiments and the familiar acrid smell began filling our sitting room, I took up my pen to record these final details. The photograph itself had been consumed in Sir Reginald's fireplace, but its memory would endure as testament to how even the most sophisticated deceptions must yield to patient, logical investigation. Outside, the December snow continued falling, covering London's streets with pristine white, while within our rooms at Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes pursued his endless war against criminality with the only weapons he required, his remarkable intellect and unwavering commitment to truth over comfortable illusion. The case of the photograph that changed overnight was closed, but as Holmes often observed, the great city around us would soon write new mysteries upon fresh pages.